The drawing room is quiet at this hour. The fire has burned down to its last good embers, and the light it throws across the ceiling is the colour of old amber, slow and soft and warm. A clock on the mantelpiece ticks with the unhurried patience of something that has kept time through many decades and is in no rush to finish. Outside, the street is empty. The city has folded itself away for the night, and only the occasional sound of a passing automobile breaks the stillness, a low hum, growing and then fading, like a thought you almost had. You are in a house that belongs to a woman of standing. You can feel it in the proportions of the room, in the way the furniture sits with the certainty of things that have always been exactly where they are. The curtains are heavy silk, drawn against the night. The carpets are thick enough to swallow sound entirely. Somewhere in another room, a maid has laid out a tray with a carafe of water and a single glass, and then withdrawn so completely that the house seems to contain no one at all. But there is a desk in the corner of this room, and at that desk a woman has been sitting for the last 2 hours. She's dressed for an evening that ended some time ago. The pearls at her throat catch what is left of the firelight. A cigarette rests in a crystal ashtray, forgotten until it went cold on its own. On the surface of the desk before her are papers, letters, ledgers, a telegram folded and unfolded so many times the creases have gone soft. She is reading. She is thinking. She is doing what she always does in this hour before sleep, when the house is hers and the work can be done without anyone watching. Her husband has gone to bed. He will rise in the morning and go to his club and his office and his lunches, and the world will regard him as the architect of the empire his grandfather built. He will accept this regard with the practised ease of a man who has never been asked to account for it. And tonight, as on most nights, his wife will have worked through the figures, answered the correspondence that required a careful hand, and decided the 3 or 4 things that most needed deciding before she allowed herself to sleep. No one will know she was here. That is the arrangement. That has always been the arrangement. And in houses like this one, in cities from New York to Chicago to San Francisco, in the years when fortunes were made and lost and made again, this arrangement was so common it had no name. It was simply the way things worked, understood by everyone and spoken of by no one. This is a story about those women, about what they knew, what they carried, what they quietly built in the rooms the history books forgot to enter. Rest now. Let the fire do its slow work. The story will come to you gently, without hurry, in the way that all the best things do. There is a particular kind of power that has no public name. It does not appear in the newspapers. It does not give speeches. It does not sit on boards or sign its name to legislation. And yet it shapes things, the direction of capital, the course of a family's fortune, the quiet decisions that determine whether a company expands or contracts, whether a deal is accepted or refused, whether a man's public career rests on solid ground or hollow air. In the first half of the 20th century in the great houses of American society, this power belonged, more often than the record shows, to women. Not all women, and not in every household, but in a remarkable number of the most formidable dynasties of that era, there was a woman behind the public man. Not a shadow exactly. Something more substantial than that. A presence so deeply embedded in the workings of power that the power itself could not have functioned without her, and yet so careful never to be seen that the credit flowed elsewhere entirely. They were called Socialites. The word, in the mouths of newspaper columnists and society reporters, carried a light, almost dismissive ring, as though it described a kind of decorative idleness, a life of luncheons and charity balls and the careful maintenance of a guest list. And in the drawing rooms and dining rooms where they moved, they cultivated exactly that impression. A woman who seemed to do nothing but be charming was never suspected of doing anything at all. But the work was real. Behind the facade of elegant leisure, a certain kind of woman in this era was keeping the books, managing the staff, entertaining the right people at exactly the right moment, reading the letters that her husband left unopened, and making the calls that her husband did not know to make. She was the intelligence of the household in every sense of the word, the memory, the judgment, the institutional knowledge that kept vast and complicated enterprises from running aground. The women in this story are not famous for the most part. That is precisely the point. The ones who are known for the wrong reasons, remembered as wives, as hostesses, as mothers. Remembered, if at all, for their jewels or their gardens or the parties they gave. The thing they actually did, the thing that mattered most, was the thing that went unrecorded. You're going to meet them now in the slow hours of this late evening. You're going to sit with them in their drawing rooms and their studies and their correspondence rooms, in the places where the real work was done. Let the night settle around you. Let the sound of the clock on the mantelpiece mark the passing of an hour that belongs only to you and to them. There is no hurry here. The world outside is quiet and the story has been waiting a long time. It can wait a little longer while you settle in. To understand how these women came to hold the power they held, you have to go back to how they were made. Not the grand public story of women's education and suffrage, and the slow, contested opening of professions. Though all of that matters, and all of that happened. You have to go back to something quieter and more particular, the specific training that the daughters of wealthy American families received in the first decades of this century, and how that training, designed to produce decorative wives, produced something else entirely. The finishing school was the institution at the centre of this education. By 1910, there were dozens of them scattered across the northeastern United States and in Europe, in Switzerland especially, in those mountain towns where the air was clean and the girls of good family could be polished to a shine away from the distractions of home. The schools had names that suggested both elegance and rigour. They occupied large buildings that had once been hotels or private estates, and their halls smelled of beeswax polish and fresh flowers, and the particular dry warmth of rooms that are heated too generously. The curriculum was not, on its surface, practical. There were lessons in French and Italian. There were classes in music, piano and voice, that were meant to give a young woman something graceful to offer at an evening gathering. There was instruction in deportment, which meant the art of moving through a room in a way that made no demands and caused no disruption. There was needlework, there was watercolour, there was the careful management of one's expression, which was perhaps the most important subject of all, though it was never listed in any prospectus. But there was also, and here is where the story becomes interesting, an education in the machinery of social life that was in practice an education in power. The girls were taught how a large household ran. They were taught the hierarchy of staff, from the butler at the top to the scullery maid at the bottom, and how to manage each level without friction. They were taught how to plan a dinner for 40, which required the coordination of a kitchen, a wine cellar, a florist, a linen inventory, and a seating arrangement that could not afford a single error. They were taught how to receive correspondence and how to answer it, not merely the form of the letter, but the strategy of the reply. A woman who could run a house of that scale could run many things. The girls who paid attention, and some of them paid very close attention indeed, understood that what was being taught in the name of domestic accomplishment was something closer to organisational management. A dinner party for 40 is a logistical operation. A week-long house party for 20 guests with its staggered arrivals and its hunting days and its evening entertainments and its complicated web of social obligations and sensitivities is a small campaign. You settle back a little. The warmth of the room is something you can feel now, steady and even, the kind of warmth that asks nothing of you. There was a woman named Edith who attended one of these schools in the early years of the century, and she remembered decades later being taught to keep a card file on every person of consequence in her family's acquaintance. The cards noted not just names and addresses, but preferences, sensitivities, the nature of the family's relationship with each individual, what was owed and what was owing. The teacher who instructed her in this system called it household management. Edith called it, later in life, the most useful thing anyone had ever taught her. The card file was not a small matter. A woman who maintained such a file for a household of any social standing was managing a network of relationships that could number in the hundreds. She knew which of her husband's business associates was sensitive about the subject of his first marriage. She knew which senator's wife had been slighted at a luncheon 3 years prior and had not forgotten. She knew which of the family's neighbours was struggling quietly with money and should not be invited to events where that disparity would become visible. She held, in other words, the social intelligence that made an entire world run without collision. And that intelligence had value beyond the social, because the world of business and the world of society were not separate in the first half of this century, in the way they sometimes seem in retrospect. The club was where deals were made, the dinner table was where alliances were formed, the country house weekend was where the men who ran things relaxed their guard and spoke more freely than they would in any office. A woman who controlled access to these settings, who decided who was invited and who was not, who sat next to whom, and what the conversation at her end of the table concerned, that woman had real influence over real events. She knew it too. The most capable of them always knew it. They did not speak of it in those terms, or not often, and not to anyone outside a very small circle of trusted equals. But in their letters, in the ones that survived, that were not burned or lost or quietly removed from family archives, you can find it in the careful and slightly guarded language of women who understood that certain things were better left unwritten. There is a letter, held in a private collection, written by a woman named Clara to her daughter, on the occasion of the daughter's engagement. The letter is warm and practical and full of the kind of advice that women of that class and generation gave to their daughters, advice about household management and the importance of a good cook, and the necessity of learning your husband's business associates' names before you had been married a month. But near the end of the letter, in a passage that is more careful than the rest, Clara writes something that reads differently from the maternal instructions that surround it. She writes that a wife who understands what her husband does will never be without recourse, that a woman who knows the accounts is a woman who knows her own security, and that this is not a matter of distrust, but of the elementary prudence that any sensible person owes themselves. That letter was written in 1922. The advice it contained was not unusual. It was, in fact, the kind of advice that passed quietly between women of that world, mother to daughter, older friend to younger, across decades and across the vast geography of American prosperity. It was the kind of advice that never made it into the etiquette books or the women's magazines, because it acknowledged something the magazines preferred not to acknowledge, that a marriage was also a business arrangement, and that the woman who forgot this fact did so at her own peril. The finishing schools were not trying to produce women who would secretly run their husbands' empires. They were trying to produce women who would be excellent wives. But the skills they taught, organization, social intelligence, discretion, the management of complex human systems, were not in the end contained by the role they were designed to serve. The women who possessed those skills in abundance found uses for them that the schools had never imagined and would not have approved. You are drifting slightly now, or perhaps you're simply settling in, the way the body does when it has decided that the night is safe. The fire in the room has gone a little lower. The clock continues its patient work. Outside there is nothing. No traffic, no voices, just the particular silence that belongs to the deepest part of the night, when the city has finally stopped pretending to be awake. The women you're going to meet were educated in exactly this way. They came from families with money and standing. They attended the right schools and made the right social debuts and married the right men whose names appeared in the financial pages and the society columns, men who belonged to the right clubs and sat on the right boards and were written about in the way that certain men of that era were written about, as embodiments of a kind of sturdy American enterprise. And then, in the drawing rooms and correspondence rooms and private studies of the houses those marriages produced, they went to work, quietly, methodically, with the thoroughness of women who had been trained to be thorough, and the intelligence of women who had been told, all their lives, that their intelligence was beside the point, and who had therefore never wasted a moment showing it to anyone who might have been threatened by it. The result was an arrangement so comfortable and so mutually understood that it required no formal agreement. The men received the credit, the women received the security, the empires continued to run, and the history books, for the most part, recorded only what they could see. The men at the desks, the men in the boardrooms, the men at the podiums. The women behind them, doing the actual work of keeping everything from falling apart, left almost no trace. Almost. Let the night carry you a little further in. The story is only beginning. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. Begin with the house itself, because the house is where everything starts. In the world these women inhabited, the house was not merely a place to live. It was a statement, an instrument, a working institution. The great houses of the American wealthy in the early 20th century were establishments in the fullest sense of the word, staffed, provisioned, managed, and presented to the world with the same attention to detail and the same stakes that a business operation of comparable scale would require. You're in one of those houses now, or rather you are hovering just above it in the way that sleep sometimes allows. Not quite inside a memory, not quite outside it either. The house is 5 stories on a street in a city that has since changed beyond recognition, though in this hour, in this particular corner of the past, it is exactly as it was. The stone facade is pale and clean. The windows are tall and framed with carved moulding. The front steps are swept twice a day. Inside, the proportions are immense in the way that money made deliberately visible produces. The entrance hall has a ceiling that rises 2 floors, and the staircase that sweeps up from it is wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast without touching. There are paintings on the walls, portraits, landscapes, a large allegorical scene in a gilded frame that no one in the family has ever particularly liked, but that was acquired 40 years ago and now belongs to the house the way the walls belong to it. The rugs are from the East, the furniture from France, the silver laid out on the sideboard in the dining room with an exactness that borders on reverence, from a silversmith in London whose name the family has used for 3 generations. The woman who runs this house, and there is always, in a house of this kind, a woman who runs it, has been awake since 7. By 8, she has spoken with the housekeeper about the week's menus and the state of the linen inventory. By 9, she has reviewed the household accounts, noting the delivery charges from the previous week, and making a small adjustment to the budget for the kitchen that will save, over the course of a month, a sum that is not large, but is not nothing. By 10, she has answered 6 letters, dictated 2 more to the secretary who comes in 3 mornings a week, and telephoned the florist to discuss the arrangement for a dinner that will take place on Thursday. It is the dinner that occupies most of her thinking today. Thursday's dinner is not a social occasion, or not, primarily. It is a piece of strategy. Her husband's company is in negotiation with a man named Patterson, a man from the Midwest who has made his money in a way that is respectable but not quite fashionable, and who wants very badly to be regarded as fashionable. The dinner is designed to make him feel that he has arrived. This means inviting the right people, not the grandest names, which would be intimidating, but the second tier, the names that a man from the Midwest would recognize and would be pleasantly surprised to find himself sitting across from. It means a menu that is elegant without being showy. It means a table arrangement that places Patterson next to the woman who is married to the man whose opinion of Patterson matters most, so that by the end of the evening, a private conversation will have happened that would not have happened in any office. Her husband does not know the exact mechanism of this plan. He knows that a dinner is happening on Thursday and that he should be pleasant to Patterson. He trusts his wife to handle the rest, and the rest is everything. The management of a house of this scale involved, in practice, the oversight of a staff that might number anywhere from 8 to 30, depending on the season and the nature of the household. There was the butler, who was the general of the downstairs operation, the man who managed the footman, oversaw the dining service, maintained the wine cellar, and received visitors. There was the housekeeper, who was his feminine equivalent for the upstairs, the woman responsible for the maids, the linen, the cleaning schedules, the quiet machinery of daily maintenance that kept the house presentable at all times. There was the cook, who ran the kitchen with an authority that was not to be challenged, and beneath her a hierarchy of kitchen staff that had its own internal politics and its own chain of command. The lady of the house managed all of them, but she managed them through layers. She spoke directly to the butler and the housekeeper. She communicated with the cook through the housekeeper, generally unless the matter was important enough to warrant a direct conversation. The footmen and the maids she saw in the course of the day but did not address on matters of household management. They received their instructions from the housekeeper, who received hers from the lady. This sounds, written out in this way, like a simple thing. It was not a simple thing. It was a human system of the kind that produces at its best an impression of effortless precision and, at its worst, a slow accumulation of resentments and miscommunications that eventually breaks down completely. The management of household staff in this era required a particular combination of authority and tact, enough firmness to maintain standards, enough consideration to keep good people from leaving, and enough judgment to know in every individual case which of these was called for. The cook was the most delicate of all the relationships. A good cook was irreplaceable. A great cook, the kind whose food made the dinners memorable, who could execute a 12-course meal without a single dish arriving at the wrong temperature, who knew instinctively how to adjust a menu for a guest with a dietary restriction without making the adjustment visible. A great cook was worth almost any amount of management. The women who ran the great houses knew this, and they cultivated their cooks with a care that bordered on diplomacy. There are accounts of women spending an hour in the kitchen each morning, not because anything required their supervision, but because the cook felt valued by the visit, and a cook who felt valued produced better food. You are somewhere between wakefulness and sleep now, or nearly there, and the house is quieter than it was. The kitchen has gone dark. The cook retired hours ago after leaving the morning preparations in their precise arrangement, the bread set to rise under a cloth, the bones in their pot, the day's first tasks already organised and waiting. The butler has turned off all but one lamp in the entrance hall. The footmen have removed the last of the evening's evidence, the glasses, the ashtray, the decanter. But the woman at the desk is still working. She will work for another half hour, perhaps longer. She's reading a letter from her husband's solicitor, a letter that arrived this morning and was placed by the secretary in the pile of correspondence that required her personal attention before it could be dealt with. The letter concerns a property in the country, a question about a lease, a renewal, a tenant who has been in place for many years and who has made a request that is not unreasonable, but that sets a precedent that could be problematic. She's thinking about it. She's turning it over in the way that she turns things over, quietly and methodically, without drama. Her husband is upstairs. He will not see this letter, or not before she has decided what to do about it. This is not subterfuge, or rather, it is a kind of subterfuge so normalised in their marriage that neither of them would have recognised the word. It is simply how things work. She handles the correspondence that requires handling. He handles the things that require his presence in the world. They have arrived at this division of labour through years of practice and a gradually deepening mutual understanding of what each of them is good at. He's good at the public things, at the meetings and the presentations and the lunches where the fish course goes on too long, and the brandy after is warm and the conversation drifts toward deal-making as naturally as water runs downhill. He is charming. He is easy in the company of other men. He has the kind of confidence that comes from never having been seriously doubted by anyone who mattered to him, and that confidence reads, in a room, as authority. She is good at the private things, at the reading and the thinking and the correspondence and the management of the 40 variables that are always in motion at once. She is also charming when she needs to be, but her charm is of a different order. It is the kind that makes people feel that they are being genuinely seen, which is a rarer and more powerful thing than the charm that simply fills a room with good feeling. Together they are formidable. Separately he would manage, but not as well. Separately she would manage better than he gives her credit for, but that is a thought she keeps to herself, in the private room of her own judgment, where she keeps the things that do not need to be said. The house settles around you both, patient and warm. The fire breathes its last. The night outside is very still. Every house of consequence had one. Sometimes it was a proper room, fitted with a writing table and a specific chair, and a view of the garden that was meant to be pleasant without being distracting. Sometimes it was a corner of the morning room or the sitting room, a desk placed near a window and equipped with the things that work requires. The ink, the blotter, the silver letter knife that was a gift from someone, and that has been in this spot for so long it has become part of the room's architecture. Sometimes it was nothing more than a small table in the bedroom, with a lamp that could be angled to give enough light without disturbing a sleeping husband. But wherever it was, and whatever form it took, the correspondence room, or the correspondence corner, or the correspondence table, was the actual nerve centre of the household. More real business was transacted there than in any boardroom. More important decisions were made there than at any club lunch. And the woman who sat at that table, in the early morning or the late evening or both, was doing work that mattered more than almost anyone acknowledged. The correspondence of a wealthy household in this era was staggering in its volume. There were social letters, the invitations, the acceptances, the regrets, the thank you notes that had to follow every dinner and every gift and every act of hospitality within a specific and somewhat demanding window of time. To fail to send a thank you note within a day of a dinner was a social statement, read as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud. To send one that was too brief was an insult. To send one that was too effusive was embarrassing. The calibration of the social letter was in itself a skill that took years to acquire. There were the letters to tradespeople, the florist, the wine merchant, the milliner, the dressmaker, the bootmaker, the various shops that supplied the household with the things it required. Some of these could be handled by the secretary or the housekeeper, but the ones that touched on matters of money or quality or long-standing relationships required the lady's attention. A letter to the wine merchant about a case that had arrived with 2 bottles broken was not merely a complaint. It was a negotiation, and it had to be conducted in a way that preserved a relationship that the household depended on, while also making clear that the breakage was unacceptable and would be compensated. There were the letters that related to the family's charitable and civic obligations. The women of this world were expected to be involved in philanthropy, and most of them were. But the involvement was not merely a matter of lending a name to a cause. It required the management of committees, the organisation of events, the maintenance of relationships with the organisers of other committees, and the navigation of the complex social politics that attended any gathering of women who each believed, with some justification, that they were the most capable person in the room. And then there were the other letters, the ones that did not announce themselves as belonging to any particular category. The letters from the solicitor about the property in the country, the letters from the bank manager about the account that was structured in a way the lady understood better than her husband did, the letters from her husband's business partner that arrived, occasionally, and that she handled with a delicacy and a thoroughness that the business partner had come to rely on without ever quite acknowledging that he was relying on it. "You're drowsy now," or very nearly. The warmth of the room has settled into something even and complete, like a blanket that fits exactly. The sounds of the house have dropped away one by one until there is only the clock, and even that seems to be growing softer, the ticks spacing themselves further apart in the way that time sometimes does when the night is deep enough. There was a woman named Margaret who ran her husband's import business for nearly 8 years, without either of them entirely admitting that this was what she was doing. The business imported textiles from Europe, fine linens from Ireland, silk from France, wool from Scotland, and sold them to the department stores and the high-end dressmakers in New York and Chicago and Boston. Her husband had inherited the business from his father and had a good deal of charm and the right instincts for the social part of commerce, the lunches with buyers, the trips to see the mills, the dinners that were partly pleasure and partly business in the way that all the best dinners were. But the operational side, the tracking of shipments, the management of the currency exchange that made European purchasing complicated, the relationships with the customs brokers and the shipping agents, the correspondence with the mills themselves about quality and delivery schedules, this side of the business had been managed in the father's time by a man named Hopkins who had worked for the family for 30 years and who knew the operation down to the last bolt of fabric. When Hopkins retired, a year into the marriage, her husband had hired a series of managers, none of whom lasted very long, and had grown increasingly anxious about the operational side of a business that he did not, in truth, understand very well. Margaret understood it. She had understood it almost from the beginning, because she had paid attention in the way that she paid attention to everything. Quietly, without making a display of it, reading the papers that her husband left on his desk, asking the questions that seemed like social curiosity, but were in fact methodical investigation. By the time the third manager left, she had proposed, carefully and in a manner that left her husband feeling that the idea had been partly his, that she help organise the correspondence and the record-keeping until a suitable replacement could be found. The replacement was not found for 8 years. During that time, Margaret ran the operational side of the business from the correspondence table in the morning room of their house on East 63rd Street. She hired a secretary who came in 5 mornings a week. She maintained the accounts in a system she had developed herself, adapted from the ledger books she had found in the Hopkins files and improved upon. She corresponded directly with the mills in Ireland and France and Scotland, signing letters on behalf of the company with her husband's name, a practice so common in the era that no one who received the letters found it remarkable. She did not take a salary. She did not have a title. She was not a director of the company or a partner, or any of the things that would have given her position a formal standing. She was a wife who was helping with the correspondence. She was very good at helping with the correspondence. The business did well during those years, better, in fact, than it had done in the last years of Hopkins' tenure, when the old man's energy had begun to flag and certain relationships had gone unattended. The mills were happy. The buyers were happy. Her husband was happy, in the particular way of a man who is being made comfortable, and who attributes his comfort to his own good management. She was not bitter about this, or rather she had found a way of not being bitter about it that involved a very clear private understanding of the situation and a very careful public performance of something different. She knew what she was doing. She knew what it was worth. She knew that the credit would not come to her, and she had made her peace with this in the way that a practical person makes peace with the weather, not with enthusiasm, but with the recognition that there is no profit in fighting it. What she received in return was not nothing. She received security, which in the early years of this century meant more to a woman than it is perhaps easy to understand now. She received a household run exactly as she wished it to be run, because the woman who controls the money controls the household. She received in the private ledger of her own estimate the knowledge that she was capable of more than the world could see, and that this capability was hers regardless of whether anyone acknowledged it. And she received, in the practical daily work of the correspondence room, something that she had not expected when she began: the deep satisfaction of a complicated problem handled well, the pleasure of a letter perfectly calibrated, the quiet pride of a shipment that arrived on time and in good order, because she had written the right letters to the right people in October, and had followed up in November, and had noticed, in February, a discrepancy in the customs records that would have become a problem in March if she had not caught it. These satisfactions were not small. They were in the way of all real work among the most reliable pleasures available to a person with genuine abilities. The morning room was warm. The secretary was efficient. The letters arrived and were answered, and the business continued. It was a good life, taken on its own terms. She had learned to take it on its own terms. Let that settle. Let the warmth of it settle. The night is very far along now, and the house is completely still. Thursday arrived in the way that Thursdays do in late October, grey and cool, with a light that comes in low through the windows and lies across the floor, at an angle that makes everything look slightly more serious than it did in summer. The florist had delivered the arrangements at 10 in the morning, white roses and eucalyptus, placed in the drawing room and on the mantelpiece in the dining room, where they would be visible from the table without overpowering the conversation. The wine had been brought up from the cellar the previous evening to breathe. The menus had been printed on cards in a small italic hand by the daughter of the cook, who had inherited her mother's precision and applied it to lettering. Dinner was at 8. The guests would begin arriving at 7:30, because there was a hierarchy in these things. The first guests arrived at the time stated, the middle guests arrived 10 minutes after, and the guests of greatest importance, or those who wished to project it, arrived last, which in this case would be Patterson and his wife if the evening was going according to plan. The woman who had designed this evening was dressed and in the drawing-room by 7. She was wearing a gown that was quiet in colour, a dark blue that read as almost black in certain lights, and pearls that were real but not ostentatious. She had learned, in the years of managing these evenings, that the woman who draws too much attention to herself at her own dinner draws it from the table, and a dinner that is supposed to accomplish something is not well served by a distracted room. Her jewellery was chosen to complete the impression of a room, not to compete with it. Her husband was beside her, in a dinner jacket that fitted him perfectly, as all his clothes fitted him. He was in good spirits, which was useful. He had been to the club that afternoon and had played well at billiards, which always improved his temper. He was ready to be pleasant to Patterson, which was the main thing required of him this evening. The guests arrived in the order that had been designed for them. First came a couple named Wallace. He was a judge, a man of great formal presence and easy social warmth, the kind of guest who gives a room its confidence. His wife was a woman of 60 who had known the hostess's mother, and whose presence implied a certain kind of continuity, a social pedigree that extended backward in a way that Patterson, with his Midwest money, would find reassuring rather than intimidating. These were people of substance, the Wallace's presence said, but they are not difficult people. You can belong here too. Then came an editor at one of the magazines, a man of considerable cultural standing who was known for his conversation, and who had the gift of making everyone he spoke to feel that they were the most interesting person he had talked to all week. Then, a couple from the banking world, not the senior partner, who would have been too grand, but the man who was being positioned to become senior partner, whose own standing was still rising, and who therefore had something in common with Patterson that the senior partner would not. And then, at 20 minutes to 8, Patterson and his wife. He was larger than she had expected, a big man from the plains, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been outdoors in a lot of weather, and hands that still looked like they remembered physical work even though it had been 20 years since he'd done any. His wife was small and careful and watchful in the way of women who have married above what the world originally expected of them and have not forgotten it. The hostess had anticipated the wife. She had placed her at dinner next to the judge, who was the warmest and most considerate man in the room and who would make her feel immediately at ease. The editor was on the wife's other side, which was perhaps a slight miscalculation. He could be intimidating. But the editor had been briefed in the indirect way that such briefings happened, that Mrs. Patterson would benefit from a conversation about Kansas, which was where she had grown up, and which the editor happened to know well from a reporting trip he had made there some years before. He would find his way to it. Patterson himself sat across the table from the woman who was being positioned to become the wife of the next senior partner at the banking firm. This was the key placement of the evening. The woman's husband was 2 seats away, and would be occupied with the hostess on one side and a perfectly pleasant member of the board of the city's Natural History Museum on the other. The woman, her name was Eleanor, was charming in a specific and useful way. She had grown up with money but had married into finance and therefore understood both worlds. She would talk to Patterson in a way that made him feel that the world he was entering was welcoming without making it feel closed, because Eleanor had the gift of making every room feel like it had always had space for you in it. The dinner proceeded as these dinners proceeded when they were well managed. The fish course was excellent, a sole done in butter and capers, simple and perfect, the kind of food that required complete confidence to serve because there was nothing to hide behind. The wine was good without being showy. The conversation moved in the way that well-managed conversation moves, lightly at first, finding its rhythm through general topics, and then, as the evening warmed, becoming more specific, more revealing, more genuinely interesting. At some point after the main course, in the natural pause that follows a good meal before the dessert arrives, the thing that was supposed to happen happened. Patterson said something, a question probably, the kind of question that follows from a conversation that has been going well, and Eleanor answered it in a way that drew her husband into the conversation, and the 3 of them spoke for 8 minutes about something that had nothing to do, on its surface, with the business deal that was in negotiation. But by the end of those 8 minutes, Patterson's impression of the banking firm and of the man who would soon be its senior partner had shifted, not dramatically, but measurably. This was the art of it. The dinner table as a boardroom was not a place where decisions were made openly. It was a place where the conditions for decisions were established, where impressions were formed and revised, where the intangible thing called trust, which was the actual currency of the world these people moved in, was manufactured through the patient application of hospitality, judgment, and a seating plan. You're very quiet now, or the room is, both perhaps. The clock has become something in the background that you're no longer counting. The dinner has ended, in the story and in the evening, and the guests have gone out into the October night, and the house has returned to itself. The staff moving through the dining room with the practiced efficiency of people who have done this many times before, removing the evidence of the meal, restoring the room to its daytime stillness. The hostess was in the drawing room when the last guest left, and she received their thanks with the warmth and the slight distance of someone who has given a great deal of energy to an evening and is now beginning to feel its absence. She was gracious to Patterson, who turned at the door and said something about what a remarkable woman her husband had married, which was the precise kind of compliment that a woman of her intelligence received with a smile and filed, correctly, in the category of things that were meant well but did not quite land. Her husband was in good spirits. The evening had gone well, he felt. Patterson seemed like a sound fellow. Eleanor had apparently made quite an impression on him. He mentioned this in the drawing room after the guests had left, as though it had happened organically, as though Eleanor had simply been charming and Patterson had simply been receptive, and the evening had simply been a pleasant one. She agreed that the evening had gone well. She allowed him to tell her about his impressions. She said the right things in the right places, and then, when he had gone to bed, she sat for a little while longer in the drawing room, in the quiet that she had been moving toward all evening, and let herself feel the satisfaction of work that had been done correctly. It was a particular kind of satisfaction, not glory exactly, not recognition, something quieter and more private than either of those, the satisfaction of a complicated thing that had worked, the satisfaction of knowing, in the silent room where no one was watching, exactly what had happened and why. She finished what was left of her wine. She turned off the lamp. She went up the stairs in the dark, the way she knew the house well enough to do. In the autumn of 1924, a woman named Harriet Aldrich took over the management of her husband's publishing company and ran it for the next 11 years. This is not in the public record how it is described. The public record, the trade announcements and the industry directories and the company history that was eventually written and printed in a small edition to mark the firm's 50th anniversary, describes a period of steady growth under the leadership of her husband, who was a man of good taste and sound instincts, and whose name appears on the spines of several important books as the publisher who had the intelligence to see their value. But Harriet's diaries survive. They're held in a university library in New England, donated by her daughter some years after Harriet's death, and they describe something different. Not a fraud exactly. Her husband did have good taste, and he did acquire those books, and his instincts were not entirely fictional. But the instincts were often backed by information that he himself had not gathered, and the decisions he made confidently in public had, in most cases, been made cautiously in private first, in the morning room of their house on the hill, over tea and the weekly accounts, in conversation with a woman who had read the manuscript before he had, and had given him her assessment in the careful language they had developed for the purpose. A language that was not quite a code but functioned as one, in which she said what she thought in terms that he could absorb without feeling supplanted. She was careful about this. Very careful. She understood that there was a texture to the influence she had developed, and that it was the texture as much as the influence itself that determined whether the arrangement held or broke. A man can accept a great deal from a wife who appears to be supporting him. He can accept considerably less from a wife who appears to be leading him. The difference is not in the content of what is said, but in the framing, and the framing requires constant attention. Harriet had learned the framing from her mother, who had learned it from hers. It was a kind of knowledge that passed through the female line of certain families the way musical ability passes, not guaranteed, but present more often than not, and recognizable when it appeared. It involved a fluency in the grammar of deference, a grammar so well practiced that it could carry almost any content without the content becoming visible. You are breathing more slowly now, perhaps. The night has that quality, that long, quiet quality that only comes in the deepest hours, when the world has entirely stopped. Let it have its depth. There is no rush. The ledger was her instrument. She kept it herself, in a handwriting that was precise and small, in the green books that the company's accounts were kept in, but that she had taken as her own private record. The green books tracked the manuscripts under consideration, the advances offered and accepted or declined, the costs of production against the anticipated returns, the sales figures that the bookshops reported, and that the company's own accountant then compiled and reported in aggregate. Harriet tracked everything separately and in more detail. She tracked the individual performance of each title, not just the season's aggregate. She tracked the patterns, which authors returned the best investment over time, which genres were growing and which were declining, which bookshops in which cities were reliable and which were not. She tracked the competition, what the other publishers were acquiring and at what prices, which authors they were pursuing who might also be pursuing her husband's firm, where the gaps in the market were. This intelligence she distilled into the conversations at the morning table. It came out as questions generally. Have you thought about what might happen if the mystery market keeps expanding? Do you think Hartley's new book is as strong as the last one? Because the figures on the last one were, and here she would give the figure, casually, as though she happened to remember it rather than having it written in a green book upstairs. Did you notice that Bernstein is looking for a new publisher? Because I ran into his wife at the committee luncheon, and she said something that made me wonder. He took these observations and brought them to the office. Sometimes he acted on them quickly. Sometimes he held them for a week, and then acted on them in a way that made them feel like his own idea, which she had no objection to, since the point was the action, not the attribution. Sometimes he disagreed with her assessment and said so directly, which was allowed. She had opinions, not instructions, and she kept them visibly in the category of opinions, and occasionally he was right and she was wrong, which she noted in the Green Book with the same neutrality she brought to everything else. The year she was most right and most consequential was 1929. The crash happened in October of that year, and the publishing world, like every other world, was shaken to its foundations. Her husband's instinct, the instinct of many men in business that autumn, was to contract sharply, to reduce the acquisition of new titles, to let some staff go, to pull in and wait for the storm to pass. This was not an unreasonable instinct. Many firms followed it and survived. But Harriet had been watching the figures more closely than her husband had. She had noticed in the sales reports from the previous 18 months something that the aggregate numbers obscured. The backlist, the older titles, the reliable sellers, the books that had been in print for years, had been growing steadily even as the new releases fluctuated. People bought backlist titles when they were anxious, it seemed. Familiar books, books they already knew or had heard about for years, books that promised a known quantity of pleasure rather than the uncertain investment of something new. Her advice, delivered at the morning table with the careful framing of a question rather than a recommendation, was not to contract but to hold the backlist aggressively and to acquire very selectively in the areas where the backlist was weakest. Her husband thought about it for 3 days and then put it into practice. The firm survived the Depression years in better shape than most of its competitors, and its backlist became the foundation on which a period of genuine growth was built in the late 1930s. The 50th anniversary history does not mention this. It describes her husband's sound instincts in a period of economic difficulty, his willingness to make difficult decisions, his foresight in building the backlist into the strength it became, all of which is technically accurate, none of which is the whole story. Harriet did not mind, or said she did not mind, which may or may not have been the same thing. The diaries are not bitter on this point. They are, if anything, rather dry. She notes the anniversary history's publication the way she notes other publishing developments, with a careful attention to accuracy and a complete absence of drama. She writes that it is a reasonably well-produced book, and that the cover is better than some of the firm's recent choices. She was an interesting woman, Harriet Aldrich. She had more intelligence than most of the room she moved through, and she had found a way to use it in the limited space available without letting the limitation diminish her. This is not a simple thing. It requires a particular kind of discipline. The discipline of working within constraints that you have not chosen, and do not prefer but that you have accepted, and of finding within those constraints a domain that is genuinely yours. The green books were hers. The analysis was hers. The judgment was hers. These things could not be given to someone else in the history or the anniversary volume. They remained, however uncelebrated, exactly what they were. The private record of a capable mind at work over many years, doing work that mattered, in a room where the morning light came through the windows and the tea was reliably good, and the satisfaction was entirely internal. The night is deep around you now, very deep. The green books are closed and the morning will be ours yet. There was another stage on which this kind of influence operated, and it was, in many ways, the most important one. The country house, the long weekend, the days between Friday afternoon and Monday morning, when the ordinary structures of business life dissolved and a different kind of work became possible. The country houses of the American wealthy in the early 20th century were remarkable institutions. They ranged in scale from the truly enormous, the Newport cottages that were actually palaces, the Hudson Valley estates that comprised hundreds of acres and required dozens of staff to maintain, to the more modest but still considerable. The Connecticut farmhouse expanded over decades into something that could sleep 20 guests comfortably. The Long Island summer cottage that had been winterized and extended until it was no longer either quite a cottage or quite a summer house, but something indefinite and deeply comfortable in between. What all of them shared was this. They were places where men of power relaxed. Not completely. The men who ran things in this era did not entirely relax, they were not built for it, but sufficiently. They relaxed enough to play tennis badly without shame. They relaxed enough to talk over dinner about things they would not have talked about in the city. They relaxed enough to form impressions of each other that were more genuine, and therefore more lasting, than the impressions formed across a boardroom table. And they relaxed into all of this in a world that had been constructed, managed, and sustained by the women who owned it. You're in one of these houses now, in the drowsy way of late evening. The fire here is larger than the one in the city, a proper country fire, logs not coal, with that particular smell of wood smoke that belongs outdoors, and has come inside and made itself at home. The furniture is somewhat older and more comfortable than in the city house, pieces that have been retired from formal service and now exist purely for the pleasure of sitting in them. There are books on the shelves that have actually been read, spines broken and pages turned, and the rug in front of the fire has a worn patch, that no one has bothered to repair because it has been there for 20 years and is now as much a part of the room as the fireplace itself. The guests arrived on Friday. There were 12 of them this weekend, a number that was large enough to ensure that conversations would form and reform across 2 days without becoming repetitive, and small enough that the house could absorb them without the feeling of a hotel. The invitations had been sent 3 weeks before. The guest list had been assembled over 2 evenings at the correspondence table, with the card file open and the small calculations of compatibility and purpose running quietly in the mind of the woman who was doing the assembling. Some of the guests were there for pleasure, old friends, the kind of company that made the weekend enjoyable for everyone and gave it a social warmth that a purely strategic gathering would have lacked. Some were there for specific reasons that the pleasure concealed. There was a man named Forsyth who sat on the board of a company that her husband's firm was in the process of approaching, and who had declined 3 invitations to lunch in the city on the grounds that he was too busy. He had accepted the country house weekend because it had been framed differently, not as a meeting but as an occasion, not as an approach, but as a continuing friendship between families that went back 2 generations. The Forsyths arrived with their daughter, a girl of 22 who'd recently become engaged, which the hostess had known from the card file and had acted upon by also inviting a young couple whose wedding the daughter had attended and who would provide her with pleasant company. This meant that Forsyth's wife had someone to sit with at tea while the men played tennis, and Mrs. Forsyth, having been properly entertained, meant that she would tell her husband, on the drive home, that the Marshalls were really the most delightful people and they should see more of them. The tennis on Saturday afternoon proceeded as planned. Men who are playing tennis do not think about business, or think about it only in the intervals between games, and in those intervals Forsyth and her husband were placed, by the natural operations of the game, in proximity to each other. They talked. They talked about tennis first, and then about something else, and then, toward the end of the afternoon, when the light was going golden and everyone was pleasantly tired, about the thing that had been the purpose of the weekend. She knew this was happening because she could see them from the sitting-room window, where she had been reading, or appearing to read, the book open in her lap and her attention elsewhere. She could not hear what was being said. She did not need to. The posture of the conversation told her what she needed to know. Forsyth had turned toward her husband in the way that men turn toward each other when something has interested them. Her husband had adopted the careful ease of a man who is managing his excitement. The distance between them had closed in the way that distance closes between people who are finding each other useful. At dinner that evening, Forsyth's daughter talked about her fiancé and her plans and the house they were going to take in the spring, and Forsyth's wife asked questions with the warm interest of a woman who is genuinely pleased by the good fortune of young people she's fond of, and the hostess listened and contributed and managed the conversation with the practiced ease of someone who has done this many times, and finds in it not boredom, but the steady pleasure of something she's very good at. After dinner, the men went to the study for brandy and conversation that lasted 2 hours. After the brandy, her husband came to find her in the drawing-room, where she was finishing the evening with the Forsyth women and the young couple, and his expression told her that it had gone well, the particular brightness in his eyes that appeared when something had moved in the right direction. He did not say anything specific because Forsyth was in the hall finding his coat, but he said it with his face. Sunday was gentler. There was a walk after breakfast, the long route, around the lake and back through the fields, the air cold and clean, the light of a late autumn morning lying flat and silver across the water. The Forsyths walked with them, and the conversation was entirely about the lake and the geese, and the question of whether the old oak on the south field was losing its shape in a concerning way, or merely doing what old oaks do in autumn. They had lunch, and then the guests began to leave in ones and twos, the cars pulling away down the gravel drive while the remaining guests stood on the steps in coats and waved. By 4 o'clock the house was theirs again. The staff had begun the process of restoring the house to its ordinary state, the guest rooms being stripped and the linens counted, and the kitchen beginning the particular kind of restorative cleaning that follows a weekend of constant use. The house exhaled slowly, the way any large thing does when the people have left it. She sat in the sitting room with a cup of tea that was slightly too strong, and made notes in the small notebook she kept in her cardigan pocket during weekends like this. Not detailed notes, just brief reminders. Forsyth receptive. Saturday, PM. Drive home with Margaret confirmed positive impression. Follow up Wednesday. Letter from her husband, she thought, not call. And then a small circle next to Forsyth's name, which meant she thought it was done. It was done. The follow-up letter was sent on Wednesday. A lunch was arranged for the following month. The business that had been the point of the weekend was concluded before the year was out, and concluded on terms that were favourable, because Forsyth had formed a good opinion of her husband over a weekend in the country, which was exactly what the weekend had been designed to produce. The country house stood in the cold November landscape, patient and solid, the smoke rising from its chimneys in the still air. In the sitting room, the fire burned steadily through the evening. The worn patch on the rug caught a little of the firelight. The geese had not come back to the lake, but they would in spring. They always did. The question that gets asked when people encounter these stories is always some version of the same question. Did they mind? Did it bother them, being the person who did the work that someone else received credit for? Was there a private grief in it? A daily cost that the visible comfort and the social ease and the household authority did not adequately compensate? The honest answer is that it is different for different women, and that the diaries and the letters that survive, which are the closest thing we have to direct testimony, give a range of answers that resist reduction into a single, satisfying conclusion. Some of these women minded very much, and the records they left reflect this, carefully usually, in language that keeps its distance from direct complaint, but legibly. Some of them seem to have been genuinely content with the arrangement, not through resignation, but through a real and considered acceptance of the terms of their lives, and some of them seem to have arrived at something more complicated than either contentment or resentment, a position somewhere between the two that acknowledged the genuine losses while holding on to the genuine satisfactions with a clarity that is, in retrospect, rather striking. The satisfaction of knowing the numbers was one of the most consistently reported. This comes through in the diaries with a regularity that suggests it was not accidental. Over and over, in the private records of women who managed their husbands' finances without formal acknowledgement, there is a note, not triumphant, not bitter, simply factual, that amounts to, I know what the situation actually is. And that knowledge, whatever its other limitations, gave these women a security that was real and that they valued. You're somewhere very still now, the kind of still that comes when the thinking has quieted and the body has decided to let itself go. The night is at its deepest, and the story comes to you not as something to follow, but as something to float in, warm and unhurried as water. A woman named Frances kept the finances of her husband's textile manufacturing business from 1918 until his death in 1941. She never had a title, was never listed in any company document, and was referred to in the business's official correspondence, on the rare occasions she appeared at all, as Mrs. Conrad, never by her given name, and certainly never by any description of her role. But she knew the numbers, every number, the cost of cotton in 4 markets, the wage rates in 3 competing mills, the terms of every loan the company carried, the performance of every piece of machinery in the facility, measured against the industry average for that type and vintage of equipment, the margins on every product line. She knew these things because she had made it her business to know them, beginning in the 3rd year of her marriage when it became apparent that the company's chief accountant, a man who had been with the family since Frances's father-in-law's time and was aging, and that the institutional knowledge he carried was not being transferred to anyone. She had begun asking him questions, specific questions, careful ones, phrased as the natural curiosity of a new wife learning about the family business. He had answered her because she was charming and interested, and because he was, at heart, a man who enjoyed his subject and rarely had anyone to talk about it with. She learned bookkeeping from him, informally, over the course of about 18 months. She learned it the way people learn things when they are paying close attention and when the subject matters to them, quickly, thoroughly, and in a way that connected the abstract system to the concrete reality it described. The numbers in the ledger were not, to Frances, merely numbers. They were information about whether the machinery was running efficiently, whether the contracts were being fulfilled, whether the wages were competitive enough to keep the skilled workers who were expensive to replace. When the accountant retired, 3 years before the crash, she was ready. She did not take his title. There was no question of that. The new accountant was a young man named Kearns, who was competent and diligent and who worked from the office at the mill. Frances worked from the study at home with copies of the accounts that Kearns produced, which she reviewed with the thoroughness of someone who understood what she was looking at. She asked Kearns questions when she had them. He answered them, because Mrs. Conrad's questions were always specific and intelligent, and because the instructions she occasionally conveyed, through her husband, were always sound. Kearns knew, in the way that everyone in a small organisation always knows the things that are not officially acknowledged, that the review of the accounts happened at the Conrad house before any major decision was made. He did not know the exact nature of Mrs. Conrad's involvement. No one would have told him directly. But he was not a stupid man. He brought his reports to the office in the mill. The decisions that followed sometimes reflected questions that had not been raised in the mill office. He drew his conclusions quietly and kept them to himself. The Depression years tested the business severely. Cotton prices fell. The mills in the south, with their lower labour costs, were undercutting the northern manufacturers on every product line that could be made anywhere. Two of the company's largest customers failed in 1931 and took their accounts receivable into a bankruptcy that paid less than 40 cents on the dollar. Frances spent 6 months in that period doing nothing else but working through the numbers. She was trying to find the shape of a business that could survive on a fraction of its previous revenue while keeping enough of its workforce to be functional when the recovery came. This was not a simple problem. It involved decisions about which product lines to cut and which to protect. It involved decisions about which workers to keep, knowing that laying off skilled workers meant losing them permanently. It involved decisions about which creditors to pay in full and which to negotiate with, in what order, with what arguments. She made these decisions, she made them, and then she presented them to her husband in the form of recommendations, and he accepted them in the form of instructions to Kearns, and Kearns implemented them in the form of operations. The chain of translation meant that by the time a decision arrived at the mill as an action, it had passed through 3 people and acquired the apparent ownership of 2 of them. Frances was not one of those 2. The business survived. It survived better than several of its competitors, which is notable given the severity of the conditions it faced in those years. The decisions made in 1931 and 1932 turned out in retrospect to have been correct. Correct in their priorities, correct in their timing, correct in their assessment of which relationships were worth preserving and which contracts were worth fighting and which costs could be absorbed without permanent damage. In 1941, when her husband died of a heart attack at the age of 64, the business passed into the management of their eldest son. He was 31, competent but inexperienced in the way that a man can be competent and inexperienced simultaneously. Frances spent the next 2 years working with him as she had worked with his father, in the same framework of informal advice and morning conversations and the careful presentation of analysis as suggestion. By the time he was ready to manage without her, which was another 3 years after that, he had a business that was well positioned and a clear understanding of its numbers that he had developed himself, with his mother's help, over 5 years of being guided through them. He called her in later years the best business mind he had ever known. He said this in the company of other people, at a dinner held to mark the company's centenary, and people smiled and attributed it to the affection of a son for a mother who had supported him in difficult years. Frances, who was in her mid-70s by then, and had been watching the room manage its impressions for more than 50 years, received the compliment with a grace that gave nothing away. She smiled, she thanked her son. She turned to the woman on her left and asked about the dessert wine, which was a Sauternes, and which was, she observed, rather better than the one they'd had at the previous year's dinner. The numbers were hers. They had always been hers. The night holds all of it gently, the way the night holds everything, without judgment, without memory, with only the slow, steady patience of time. If you're drifting now, let yourself go. Subscribe so the next story is waiting when you return. Sleep well. There was a specific instrument that these women wielded with particular skill, and it has largely disappeared from the world they inhabited, which makes it difficult now to convey exactly how powerful it was. The letter of introduction, a piece of paper, folded and sealed, that said, "I know this person. I vouch for this person. In the world I am part of, and in the worlds I can reach, this person has my endorsement." In the economy of the early 20th century, the letter of introduction was not a formality. It was a key. The world these women moved in was a world of gatekeepers, of clubs and boards and associations and institutions, each with its own membership and its own hierarchy and its own way of deciding who was admitted and who was not. The gates were not all locked for the same people, and they were not all unlocked by the same keys, but they all responded to the letter of introduction from the right person. And who was the right person in any given situation? This was the knowledge that the women who maintained the card files possessed. They knew, with a specificity that was the product of years of observation and the accumulated intelligence of social networks extending back decades, which letter from which person would open which door. They knew that a letter from the Mrs. Henderson, not the younger Mrs. Henderson, the older one, the one who'd been a Whitmore before her marriage, would smooth the way for anyone seeking admission to the hospital board. They knew that a letter for the theatrical charitable committee needed to come from either the Forsyth family or the editor at the magazine, and that a letter from one was good, but a letter from both was decisive. The composition of these letters was itself a considerable art. A letter of introduction that was too warm looked like a favour being called in, which diminished the value of what it was introducing. A letter that was too restrained failed its purpose. The ideal was a letter that conveyed genuine endorsement through the quality of its attention, rather than the heat of its language. A letter that said, by virtue of its specificity and its care, that the writer knew exactly who and what she was recommending and had taken the time to say so precisely. You are floating now, or nearly. The difference between thinking and drifting has become small enough that you cannot quite locate it. The warmth of the room is not a room anymore so much as a temperature, surrounding and steady. The story continues, soft as the breathing of someone beside you in the dark. A woman named Constance managed her husband's social and professional advancement through this instrument with a mastery that was, in its way, as impressive as anything done in an office or a boardroom. Her husband was a lawyer, a good one, solid and diligent, with the kind of mind that excels at the construction of careful arguments and the kind of temperament that finds the business development side of a professional practice uncongenial. He was not by nature a man who found it easy to present himself. He was better at work than at the presentation of work. Constance presented him. Not by appearing in rooms where he should have been representing himself. That would have undermined the thing she was building. She presented him through the letters, through the dinner table placements, through the quiet conversations in which she conveyed to the right people that her husband was the man to go to for a particular kind of problem. She did this in the years before his reputation was established, when a reputation was still being built, and she did it so effectively that by the time his practice was prominent enough to carry itself, the foundation had been laid so thoroughly that almost no one could have said, looking back, exactly how it had happened. A particular letter, written in the spring of 1931, illustrates the method. Her husband had been doing work for a family named Alcott, estate work, the complicated task of settling a large inheritance that had become entangled in a number of competing claims. He had handled the Alcott matter well, but the Alcotts were not, in themselves, the kind of family whose patronage would open the next door he needed to open. The door he needed to open was at the Meridian Club, the membership of which was the most reliable indicator of a certain kind of professional standing in the city, and which had a waiting list that moved at the pace of geological time. Constance wrote to the wife of the club's membership chairman. The letter was 3 paragraphs long. The first paragraph was about the garden. The membership chairman's wife had mentioned at a dinner some months before that she was redesigning the beds at the back of her house and was struggling with a particular shaded corner, and Constance had since spoken with a gardener of her acquaintance who had a solution, which she passed along with the specific detail that distinguished a genuine piece of advice from a polite filling of space. The second paragraph was about a committee they were both involved in, and a question about the next meeting's arrangements. The third paragraph mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that her husband had recently concluded the Alcott matter. She understood the membership chairman would know the Alcotts, and had come away from it feeling that the work had been some of the most satisfying of his career. She wrote that she knew her husband was on the club's list, and that they both hoped very much to become members when the committee felt the time was right. The letter did not ask for anything directly. It did not even, quite, remind its recipient that a favour was being requested. It simply placed the right information in the hands of the right person, wrapped in the natural warmth of an established friendly acquaintance, and trusted that the information would find its way to the place where it could do its work. Her husband was elected to the Meridian Club 7 months later. He was pleased. He attributed it to his work for the Alcotts, whose name had clearly done the rounds as he had hoped it would. He was not wrong exactly. The Alcott name had done the rounds. Constance had made sure of it. She kept a copy of the letter, as she kept copies of all the important letters, in a box that lived in the bottom drawer of her correspondence table, tied in bundles with a particular kind of pale ribbon that she bought by the spool and kept specifically for this purpose. The box held 20 years of letters. Some of them were about garden corners and committee meetings and the arrangements for charity events. Some of them were about other things entirely, using the same language of domestic friendliness to carry intelligence that had nothing domestic about it. The box was not a secret. Anyone who looked in the drawer would have found it, and anyone who opened it would have found letters. But the letters, read in isolation, would have yielded little of their real content to someone who did not have the social map that would allow them to understand what each letter was doing and why it was being sent to this particular person at this particular moment. The map was in Constance's head, supplemented by the card file that sat on top of the correspondence table, and without the map the letters were just letters. This was, perhaps, the final sophistication of the method. The instrument of influence was visible, but the intelligence behind it was not, because the intelligence had no physical form that could be examined or confiscated or taken away. It lived in the understanding of a woman who had been cultivating it for decades, and it was as completely hers as anything she owned. More completely in some ways, because unlike the house and the furniture and the jewels, it could not be inherited by anyone who had not earned it the same way she had. The letters are still in the box, in the drawer of the correspondence table, which now sits in the spare bedroom of a house in Connecticut, belonging to Constance's granddaughter, who uses it to hold her children's schoolwork. The pale ribbon has faded to almost white. The ink in the letters has gone a little brown at the edges, the way old ink does. They are perfectly preserved, perfectly legible, and almost entirely impenetrable to someone who does not have the map. The night keeps them safely in the dark. Of all the industries in which the influence of these women was felt without being recorded, banking is perhaps the most striking. Banking, more than almost any other field of that era, was a world governed by trust, and trust, in the communities where private banking operated, was managed as much through social relationships as through financial ones. The man who extended a line of credit to a family was not merely assessing the family's finances, he was assessing the family. And the family as a social unit was very often understood by the women who ran it. There was a woman named Eleanor Whitfield, who was the daughter of a small regional bank's founder, the wife of the man who succeeded that founder, and the mother of the man who succeeded her husband. She was involved with the bank for 60 years, from the late 1890s to her death in 1958. In none of those 60 years did she hold any official position. Her name does not appear on any document in the bank's archive, except as a depositor and, at one point, the beneficiary of her husband's estate. But she was there. She was there in the early mornings before the bank opened, when her husband and then, later, her son reviewed the accounts and the loan applications and the larger questions of institutional strategy. She was there over dinner, where the day's business was discussed in the easy and slightly imprecise way that family businesses discuss themselves, without the formality of a boardroom, but with a thoroughness that was in some ways more complete, because nothing had to be presented for effect, and nothing had to be held back for propriety. She was there in the drawing room, where the customers who were also friends brought the complications of their finances along with the social visit, and where the appropriate response was determined partly by the warmth of the greeting and partly by the judgment that lay behind it. She knew the accounts. She knew them in the way that someone knows a landscape they have been walking through for decades. Not just the map, but the texture, the way the ground shifts under your feet in different seasons, the places where the path is reliable and the places where it gives way unexpectedly. She knew which families were sound and which were being held together by reputation rather than assets. She knew which businesses were genuinely growing and which were growing in the sense of becoming larger while becoming less stable. She knew which loans had been made for reasons of friendship rather than credit, and what the likely trajectory of those loans was. This knowledge did not express itself as power in any formal sense. She did not vote on loan applications. She did not sit at the table where decisions were made. But her husband and then her son made better decisions than they would have made without her, and this better decision-making was the institution's most important competitive advantage in a regional banking market that had, over the decades, claimed several of its competitors. You have been quiet for a while now, or the room has been quiet with you, which is the same thing in the way that sleep makes many things the same. The particulars of the story are becoming softer, not because they are less true, but because the mind at this hour takes what it needs and lets the rest drift. Let it drift. The warmth will stay. The most consequential moment in Eleanor Whitfield's 60 years of involvement with the bank came in the winter of 1932, when the institution faced the possibility of a run. A run on a bank in that era before deposit insurance was the thing that bank officers feared above all others, the point at which depositors' collective anxiety became self-fulfilling, when fear of a bank's failure caused the withdrawals that produced the failure. It had happened to 20 banks in the county in the previous 2 years. There were rumours, always in that period there were rumours, running along the telephone wires and the back fences of small cities with the speed of any contagion. Her husband was ill. He had been ill since November with a respiratory condition that would take his life the following spring, and he was managing the bank from his bedroom, which was not ideal. Her son was 32 and capable, but had not yet developed the seasoned judgment that takes time, and he knew it. The bank was holding firm, but the margin was not comfortable. Eleanor spent 3 days that January doing something that has no formal name in any business manual. She made calls, she had tea. She appeared, in the course of those 3 days, at the tables and in the drawing rooms of approximately 40 of the bank's largest depositors, and she was herself, warm, specific, interested in the things that were interesting to each of them, the gardens and the children, and the business troubles of those who had business troubles. And at some point in each conversation, naturally and without the appearance of strategy, the bank came up, and what she communicated through the quality of her certainty rather than through any argument or any figure was that the bank was sound. She did not make promises she could not keep. She did not claim that the situation was better than it was. She communicated something more important and less falsifiable than either of those things. She communicated that a woman who had lived with this institution for 30 years and who understood it as well as anyone alive was not frightened. And the people who talked to her in those 3 days, who knew her and trusted her and had seen her be right about things over many years, absorbed this signal and recalibrated accordingly. The run did not happen. Withdrawals slowed and then stopped, and then, in February, began to reverse. The bank survived the Depression years and was in good enough shape by 1936 to extend credit to 3 local businesses that the surviving competitors would not touch, which proved to be some of the most profitable loans in the institution's history. No one wrote about what Eleanor had done in January 1932. It was not the kind of thing that was written about, partly because it was not the kind of thing that had a language for itself, and partly because the woman who had done it was not interested in being written about. She was interested in the bank surviving. It survived. That was the point. Her son, who became the bank's president the following year and ran it for the next 25 years, was asked once by a journalist working on a piece about regional banking in the Midwest what he attributed the institution's remarkable stability to during the Depression years. He said it was conservative lending practices and strong customer relationships. Both of these things were true. Neither of them was the whole story. There were many women like Eleanor Whitfield in many banks in many cities and towns across the country. They were not in most cases the daughters or wives of bankers by design. They had not chosen banking careers. They were women who had found themselves in proximity to institutions of consequence, and who had, through the natural operations of intelligence and attention, become essential to those institutions without being formally recognized by them. The recognition was not, for many of them, the point. The security was the point. The functionality of the enterprise on which their security depended was the point. And the private satisfaction of work well done, in the early mornings and the late evenings and the quiet intervals between the social performances, was not nothing. It was, for some of them, a great deal. The bank still stands on its corner in the small city where Eleanor Whitfield lived and worked and died. The facade has been cleaned a number of times since her day, and the interior has been modernized in the way that bank interiors get modernized and then seem dated 15 years later. There is a small plaque inside commemorating the founders, and her father-in-law's name is on it. Her husband's name is on it. Her son's name is on it. Her name is not on it, but then she would not have expected it to be. The night is very still. There was a network. It did not have a name, or not a name that would have been recognized as such. It did not have officers or meetings or dues. It had something more durable than any of those things. It had the accumulated understanding of women who had been educating each other, across generations and across the geography of American wealth, in the specific knowledge required to do what they were doing. The network operated through the normal channels of social life, which is to say, invisibly. It operated over tea and over letters, and over the long afternoons at country houses, and the intervals between acts at the opera, and the walks after church, and the mornings when two women met for no reason beyond the pleasure of each other's company, and talked for 2 hours about things that, to an outside observer, would have looked like nothing at all. The gardening and the children and the charitable committees and the things that were happening in the families they both knew, and sometimes, underneath all of this, the thing that mattered. What passed between women in these conversations was knowledge of a specific and practical kind. It was knowledge about how to manage the relationship between what was formally true, the arrangement in which a husband ran the business and a wife managed the household, and what was actually true, which was something more complicated and more shared. It was knowledge about how to present oneself as supportive while being genuinely necessary. About how to make a man feel that the good decision was his while ensuring that the good decision was made. About how to hold information, and when to deploy it, and in what form and through which channel. Some of this knowledge was transmitted directly, mother to daughter, in the letters and conversations that marked the transition from girlhood to wifehood. Some of it was transmitted laterally, between women of the same generation who trusted each other enough to be specific, and some of it was transmitted through observation, the careful watching of a woman who was managing her situation well, by a younger woman who was learning how it was done. You're in a state now where the words arrive like warmth rather than meaning. You do not need to follow them carefully. They are already part of you, settling in the way that warmth settles layer by layer. There was a tradition in certain circles of what were called mentorship visits, a practice without a formal name in which an older woman of experience and standing would, in the first year or two of a younger woman's marriage, make herself available in a specific way, not as a social caller but as someone who had information to share. These visits happened over tea, generally, or at the older woman's home, in the sitting room rather than the drawing room, the sitting room being the room that said this is a conversation, not a performance. The content of these conversations was practical, how to manage the household accounts so that you understand them rather than merely signing off on them, how to read the financial documents that come across the desk, even when you're not officially the person whose desk it is, how to identify the staff member who is the real intelligence of the household, not always the butler, sometimes the housekeeper, occasionally a maid of many years who knows everything. How to maintain the relationships that your husband's work requires maintaining in a way that is genuine rather than merely dutiful, because only genuine warmth sustains itself across years. And something else, always, in these conversations, how to read the situation you are actually in, as opposed to the situation that its surface suggests. A marriage that looks like one thing from the outside may look like something quite different from the inside. The management of that gap, the maintenance of the public presentation while navigating the private reality, was the deepest skill of all, and the one that was most difficult to transmit in general terms. The older women who conducted these conversations tended to be specific. They told stories, their own stories, or the stories of women they had known or had heard about, with the names changed or omitted but the substance intact. They gave examples. They described the exact words they had used in a particular conversation with a particular husband or a particular man of business, not as a script to be copied, but as a demonstration that the thing could be done, that there was a way of saying what needed to be said without it becoming a confrontation. A woman named Ruth, who had spent 40 years in this mode and who had, by the middle of her life, a network of younger women who came to her over tea with the specific quality of attention that meant they needed something real, kept a notebook of what she called observations, notes, brief and cryptic to anyone who was not her, on the things she had found to be reliably true in the management of the kind of life she had been managing. She did not think of it as a manual. She thought of it as memory, a way of holding on to the things that had taken a long time to learn. One of her observations read, in full, "Never argue with the form, work within it." The form that she meant was the formal arrangement of the world she lived in, the arrangement in which certain kinds of authority were formally a husband's. She had discovered, through years of practice, that arguing with this arrangement was less effective and more costly than working within it. Working within it meant accepting the form while filling it, patiently and thoroughly, with the substance of one's own judgment. Another observation: know the numbers before you need them. This one was self-explanatory, and also not entirely self-explanatory. It was not only about financial numbers, though it was about those. It was about all the numbers that determine the shape of a situation. Who owes what to whom, who depends on what for what, where the leverage is and where it is not. A woman who knows these things is not dependent in the way that the formal arrangement suggests. She is dependent in a different and more manageable way. A third, the most important relationships are the ones that cross the formal boundary, by which she meant the relationships between women of her world and women of a different world. The cook, the housekeeper, the secretary, the maid who had been with the family for 20 years. These relationships, maintained well, gave access to a kind of knowledge that no amount of reading of financial documents and social correspondence could provide. They gave access to what was actually happening, in the household and sometimes beyond it, in the plain language of people who did not have the time or the training or the incentive to wrap what they knew in the forms of social performance. Ruth's notebook was found after her death by her daughter, who read it with the absorbed attention of someone recognizing in writing something she had always known in practice, but had never seen articulated. She made a copy of several of the observations before the notebook was included in the collection of papers donated to the family's alma mater. The copies are in a folder in a drawer of a house in Connecticut. No one has written a history of this network. The evidence for it is dispersed and fragmentary: observations in diaries, references in letters, the stories that older women told younger ones and that the younger ones in their turn passed on. It is the kind of history that leaves no single archive because it never had one, and that resists reconstruction because the women who built it were, by long habit, and by the nature of the world they operated in, very good at leaving no record of the things that most needed to be concealed. But the network was real. It sustained these women across the decades of their work. It gave them tools that they would not otherwise have had, and a sense of solidarity that, however private, was not nothing. The knowledge that you were not alone in your particular adaptation to your particular circumstances, that others had faced the same gap between formal arrangement and practical necessity, and had found their way through it, was a kind of company, quiet company, the best kind for long work in private rooms. The night carries the sound of it, barely audible, like something very far away that you can almost but not quite make out. Not all of the influence that these women exercise was directed toward financial affairs. Some of it, and the word some undersells the scope, was directed toward the shaping of cultural life, which is to say toward the question of what a city or a generation would see, read, hear, and remember. This kind of influence is harder to trace than the financial kind, because culture does not keep ledgers. But it was real, and in the cities where these women were most active, it was visible in the institutions they left behind. The museums are the most obvious example. In the first decades of the 20th century, the great American art museums were being built, the collections assembled, the galleries constructed, the endowments established. This work was officially the province of boards of trustees, which were largely male, and of the wealthy men whose names appear over the entrances and on the plaques. But the actual process of collecting art, of knowing what was worth acquiring, of finding it, of establishing the relationships with the dealers and the collectors and the European families who were, in that era, beginning to sell, this process relied very heavily on women. The women who travelled to Europe with their husbands, who spoke the languages and moved in the social circles where art was available, who had the taste formed by years of looking and the relationships formed by years of being welcomed in the right rooms. These women were, in practice, the scouts and the negotiators of a significant proportion of what ended up on the museum walls. Their names do not appear on the acquisition records generally. The records show the trustee who approved the purchase, or the dealer through whom it was made. The woman who identified the painting, who convinced the owner to sell, who wrote to her husband that this was the thing to acquire, and here was why she is elsewhere or nowhere. A woman named Beatrice accompanied her husband on 6 trips to Europe between 1905 and 1920, during which period the museum in their city acquired 23 paintings of lasting importance. Her husband was on the museum's acquisitions committee. He spoke no French and no Italian, and had not studied art in any formal way, though he had a genuine pleasure in good pictures and the kind of open generosity that is sometimes, in a collector, as valuable as knowledge. What he lacked was knowledge, and what Beatrice had was knowledge in abundance. She had studied. She had been studying without public acknowledgement since her early 20s, reading everything available in English and French and German on the subject of European painting, spending time in the galleries when she was in the city, talking to dealers and to museum staff with the genuine curiosity of someone who wanted to understand rather than to impress. She had developed relationships with several dealers in London and Paris who had come to recognise that her interest was serious and her judgment trustworthy, and who corresponded with her accordingly. You are barely present now, or rather, you are present in a different way, the way of deep rest, where the world comes to you gently rather than demanding that you go to it. The canvases hang in a cool, still museum. No one is looking at them tonight. When a painting became available, when a European family needed money, or when a dealer acquired something he thought might be right for an American institution, the communication came to Beatrice. She looked at the photographs and the descriptions and consulted the correspondence she had been keeping for years. She formed her view, and then she found the way to communicate that view to her husband in a form that he could take to the committee. Her husband was not a passive vessel for her opinions. He was a man with his own sensibility, and sometimes he disagreed with her, and occasionally he was right. But the intelligence that drove the committee's most consequential acquisitions was hers. The relationships in Europe that made those acquisitions possible were hers. The knowledge of what was coming to market and when, of which families were willing to sell and which were not, of which dealers could be trusted and which required watching, this was hers. The 23 paintings that entered the collection in those 15 years include several that are now considered the museum's most important holdings. A room in the museum bears her husband's name. The paintings in that room owe their presence there, in large part, to a woman whose name does not appear on any wall. The same pattern held in music and in literature. The women who managed the social side of cultural life, who invited the right musicians to the right house parties, who ensured that the composers and the poets and the writers of serious ambition had access to the patronage that would allow them to work, were shaping culture in ways that were real and lasting. They were not only doing it for cultural reasons. A woman who controlled access to patronage had influence over the patrons, which is to say over the men who held the money and who were learning, through the women who managed their cultural lives, what to value and why. The charitable committee was the other instrument. In every city of consequence in this era, there was a network of charitable and civic organisations, and at the centre of each of them was a woman, often several women, in a hierarchy as clear and as carefully maintained as any corporate structure. These organisations raised money, yes, but they also allocated it, and the allocation of charitable money is the allocation of social priority. What a city's charitable organisations fund, a city funds. What they decline to fund fades or fails. The women who controlled these organisations controlled, in a real sense, the soft infrastructure of American cities, the hospitals and schools and libraries and social services that the formal government did not provide and that private charity did. They decided which causes were worthy and which were not. They decided which institutions received the support that allowed them to grow and which received a polite letter of encouragement and nothing more. They managed budgets in some cases running into the millions, and they managed them with a thoroughness and a rigour that would have been recognised as professional competence in any other context. A woman named Helen ran the charitable affairs of a Midwestern city for nearly 30 years, during which time she built 3 hospitals, endowed a music school, established the city's first free library for working families, and persuaded 17 of the city's wealthiest men to donate a combined $2 million to causes they would not have prioritised without her. She had no official title in any of these institutions. She was a volunteer. She was the most influential person in the city that no one outside it had heard of. Her method was not complicated. She knew what she was doing, and she knew that what she was doing mattered, and she worked at it with the full energy of a person who has found the thing that the skills are suited to and the heart is in. She was also strategic in the way that only people with long-time horizons can be strategic. She was not managing to the next event or the next season, but to a vision of what the city should be in 10 years, which meant that the decisions she made in any given year were legible only in relation to that longer arc. The city she left behind when she died in 1947 was measurably different from the city she had found when she arrived as a young married woman in 1911. The hospitals were real. The library was real. The music school was real. These were physical institutions built with money that had not been there before, and that had found its way to these purposes because one woman had decided they were where it should go, and had spent 30 years making the case. She was given a small obituary in the city newspaper, which described her as a beloved civic volunteer. The city's official history, published some years later, mentions her in a footnote. The buildings she caused to be built bear the names of the men who donated the final large gifts, because that is how such things work. The music school is named for a family whose primary contribution was a check at the end of a process that Helen had been managing for 6 years. This is not a complaint. It is simply the form the world took. The music school still stands. On Thursday evenings in the autumn, when the light falls at that particular October angle, the sound of a piano comes from one of the upper windows and drifts down into the street below. It is a beautiful sound. The city does not know it owes it to a woman whose name it has almost entirely forgotten. The night carries it anyway. There is a specific kind of competence that becomes visible only in a crisis, because it is the kind of competence that spends most of its time making crises unnecessary. The women who managed these households and these empires were experts at this kind of preventive competence, at catching the problem before it became the crisis, at adjusting before the adjustment was urgent. But crises happened anyway, because the world does not entirely submit to good management, and in the crises the quality of the invisible work became briefly, starkly apparent. The crash of 1929 was the great crisis of this era, but it was not the only one. There were personal crises, illnesses, deaths, the sudden failure of a business arrangement that had been the foundation of a family's security. There were social crises, the scandal that threatened, the relationship that broke at an inconvenient moment, the thing that needed to be managed before it became the thing that could not be managed. And there were the smaller, more private crises that attend any enterprise of consequence. The moment when the wrong person said the wrong thing to the wrong audience, and something that had been carefully built began to tilt. A woman named Vivian faced a crisis in the spring of 1936 that had to do with her husband's bank, or rather with a member of the bank's board who had made a series of investments that he had represented to the other board members as conservative, and that had turned out to be neither conservative nor, as it emerged, entirely honest. The man in question had friends in high places and a reputation that had, until this point, been impeccable. The exposure of the situation would damage not only him, but the institution that had allowed him to sit on its board. Her husband came home on a Tuesday evening and told her. He was pale, which was unusual. He ate almost nothing at dinner and was silent in a way that was different from his ordinary quiet. After dinner, instead of going to the study as he usually did, he sat in the drawing room without a book, which was how Vivian knew that the trouble was real. She sat down across from him. She asked him to tell her exactly what had happened. He told her. It took an hour because the situation was complicated and because in the telling of it, which he had not yet done in this degree of detail even to himself, some things became clear that had not been clear before. She listened without interrupting, which was one of her gifts, the ability to receive a complicated account without the need to interject, to hold the elements of the story until it had finished and then to work through them in the right order. You're settled now, very settled, like something that has come to rest after a long time in motion. The warmth around you is not the warmth of any particular room, but of the night itself, generous and complete. When he finished, she asked 3 questions. Each question was about a specific relationship, the relationship between the board member in question and the institution's largest depositor, the relationship between the bank's legal counsel and the regulatory body that would need to be informed, and the relationship between the situation as it currently stood and the way it would be perceived by the city's newspaper if it became public before it had been addressed. Her husband answered the questions, thinking them through as he answered, and in the process of answering them began to see the shape of what needed to happen. Not because Vivian told him what to do, she did not in those terms, but because the questions she asked were the right questions, asked in the right order, and the right questions asked in the right order have a way of generating the right answers. By 9 o'clock they had a plan. It was not a simple plan, but it was a workable one. It involved an immediate disclosure to the regulatory body, conducted in a specific way that acknowledged the situation without amplifying it. It involved a conversation with the largest depositor, who needed to hear about the situation directly rather than through a third party. It involved a communication to the other board members that was honest about what had happened, while being precise about what the institution's response would be. And it involved, at the end of this sequence, a meeting with the bank's legal counsel about the exposure to the institution itself. All of this Vivian helped plan, sitting across from her husband in the drawing room with the fire between them and the night outside. The plan was presented by her husband the next morning to the bank's attorney as the plan he'd worked out over a sleepless night of thinking, which was accurate in the sense that it had been worked out over an evening of thinking, and he had indeed barely slept. The attorney, who knew the bank's affairs well and had his own opinion about the board member in question, found the plan sound. He made one small adjustment to the sequence and said it was the right approach. The situation was handled, not without cost. There was some public attention, some uncomfortable questions from the press, a period of elevated tension in the institution, but it was handled in a way that protected the bank's reputation and its depositors and, in the end, resulted in a clearer set of governance practices that made the institution genuinely stronger. The board member resigned. The regulatory body issued a letter that was serious but not devastating. The largest depositor stayed. Her husband, in the weeks that followed, was more steady than he might otherwise have been. He had had the benefit of working through the problem with someone he trusted completely, in the privacy of his own drawing room, before he had to manage it in public. The plan that he carried into the attorney's office had been tested, at least in outline, against a mind as good as his own, and it held up. This gave him a confidence that showed. Vivian watched all of this from the position she always occupied, present, necessary, invisible. She attended the dinner that was held some months later to celebrate the successful outcome of a difficult year. She was gracious and warm and asked good questions about people's families. She did not mention the drawing room or the 9 o'clock plan. She was wearing the pearls she always wore to dinners. The fire in the hotel's ballroom was adequate but not as good as the one at home. The attorney, who was a perceptive man and who had known the family for many years, came and found her at one point during the evening. He said something to her that he said quietly, as though aware that it was the kind of thing that ought to be said quietly. He said that the bank was fortunate in its family. He held her gaze a moment longer than social convention strictly required. She thanked him and said something pleasant and moved on to the next conversation. She knew what he meant. He knew what he meant. No one else needed to know. The ballroom was warm. The evening was going well. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in late spring, opening its windows to the evening air, filling its streets with the particular unhurry of a night when the days have finally grown long enough to make the evenings feel like a gift. Somewhere across town the drawing room was quiet and empty and already waiting for the morning. At some point in the middle of the 20th century, the world these women had built their lives around began to change. The change was slow at first, almost imperceptible, and then it was fast. Women moved into offices. They entered professions that had been closed to them. They held titles that a generation earlier would have been held only by men. The formal arrangement that had governed these women's lives, the arrangement in which a wife's intelligence was deployed through the mechanism of a husband's authority, became less necessary, and for many women, less acceptable. The question of what the women in this story thought about this change is a complicated one. Their daughters' lives were different from theirs, different in ways that the daughters had fought for and that, in many cases, the mothers had quietly supported, even when the supporting was done from within the old form rather than against it. A woman who had spent 40 years managing a fortune through her husband's name, while teaching her daughters to know the numbers, was not exactly an obstacle to the world that was coming. She was, in some ways, its preparation. The knowledge passed down was not only the knowledge of how to work within constraints, it was also the knowledge of what the work was, which is to say the knowledge of what was actually happening in the rooms and the offices and the boardrooms where the decisions were made. A daughter who had grown up watching her mother manage the household accounts and read the correspondence and conduct the dinners with strategic care had a different understanding of how power worked than a daughter who had been shielded from it. She had seen it. She knew its texture. Some of this knowledge translated directly into the new world. The organizational competence, the management of complex human systems, the ability to read a room and to understand the invisible architecture of a meeting or a negotiation. These things worked in boardrooms in the 1960s and the 1970s the same way they had worked in drawing rooms in the 1920s and the 1930s. The form had changed. The substance had not changed at all. The night is very quiet. You have passed through the stage of thinking about the words and entered the stage where they come to you like warmth, like the last light of a fire, like the gentlest of company. A woman named Dorothy, who had been born in 1895 and had spent her adult life in exactly the arrangement described in these pages, the capable wife behind the prominent husband, the invisible intelligence behind the visible authority, lived to see her granddaughter become the first woman to serve on the board of a corporation that her grandfather had founded. Dorothy was 83 at the time of the appointment, and had been, for many years, confined to a chair in the sitting room of the house where she had lived for 60 years. Her granddaughter came to tell her. She drove from the city on a Tuesday afternoon and sat across from her grandmother in the sitting room with the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, and told her about the board, about what it meant and how it had happened and what she planned to do with the position. Dorothy listened with the absolute attention that had, in her life, been one of her greatest gifts, and when her granddaughter finished, she sat for a moment in silence. Then she said, "Tell me what the other board members want. Not what they say they want, but what they actually want." Her granddaughter, who was 37 and had a business degree from one of the better schools and had been working in finance for 12 years, paused, and then she said, "I'm not sure I know yet." "Good," said Dorothy. "That means you're paying attention." She was quiet again for a moment, looking out the window at the garden that had gone a little wild in the years since she had been able to tend it herself. Then she said a few more things, in the careful and specific way that she had always communicated the things that mattered. She talked about reading a room, about the difference between what is said in a meeting and what is decided before the meeting, about the importance of the relationships that cross the formal boundary, the assistant, the person who books the travel, the woman who manages the scheduling, about knowing the numbers before you need them. Her granddaughter recognized most of this. She had been receiving a version of this education all her life, in the form of observation and the occasional direct comment from a woman who rarely said anything about power or business directly, but whose examples, over the years, had accumulated into something very like a course of instruction. She had not thought of it in those terms until that Tuesday afternoon in the sitting room, with the sun pressing against the curtains and the garden going slowly wild outside. Dorothy died the following year. Her granddaughter spoke at the service and said that her grandmother had been the most capable person she had ever known, and that she had learned more about her work from her than from any school or any mentor or any book. The people at the service who had known Dorothy well smiled at this in the specific way of people who recognize a truth they have been sitting with for some time. The inheritance was not only material. The house and the furniture and the investments that Dorothy left behind were substantial, but the thing that mattered most, the thing that had the most lasting value, was not the money. It was the knowledge, the specific and hard-earned understanding of how power actually worked, accumulated over 60 years of operating within a system that required intelligence and offered almost no credit for it. The granddaughter carried it. She served on the board for 9 years and was, by all accounts, one of its most effective members. She was known for her reading of the room, for her understanding of what was actually at stake in any given discussion, for her ability to identify the real question, underneath the stated question, and to redirect a meeting toward it without anyone quite noticing the redirection. She was known for knowing the numbers. She kept a copy of her grandmother's letter in the middle drawer of her desk. The letter had been written in 1961, when the granddaughter was in her mid-teens, a long letter, many pages, with the careful handwriting of a woman who had been writing important things by hand all her life. The letter was not about business, it was about how to see, which is not the same thing, but is the foundation of everything else. Read everything, the letter said, not just the things that are meant for you to read. Read what is being left out as carefully as what is being put in. Read the silence after a sentence and ask yourself what the sentence was moving toward and decided not to say. Read the arrangement of people in a room. Read the order in which things happen. The world is always telling you something, in a language that takes time to learn and that no school teaches, but that can be learned. You have the mind for it. I can see that you have the mind for it. Trust what the mind is doing even when it is working quietly. The letter rests in the middle drawer. The granddaughter is in her late 60s now, and the drawer has been in many offices across many years, but the letter has travelled with it. Some knowledge is too important to leave behind. Some inheritances take up no space at all but weigh exactly as much as they should. The rooms are quiet now. The drawing rooms and the morning rooms and the correspondence rooms and the sitting rooms where this work was done over decades. They are quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when the people who lived in them have been gone for a long time and the silence has settled into the walls and the floors and the particular angle of light that comes through the windows at certain times of day. Some of these rooms still exist, in houses that have been preserved or converted or simply survived the intervening decades without being demolished. You can walk through them sometimes, in the houses that are now museums or historic sites, or that have been open to the public for one reason or another. The furniture may or may not be the original furniture. The arrangements may or may not reflect the arrangements of the rooms as they actually were, but the proportions are the same, and the light is the same, and if you stand in the right place at the right time of day, something of the original quality of the room is still there. What the rooms held was work. Not the work that is commemorated in plaques and histories and anniversary publications, but the other kind. The continuous, unsung work of keeping complicated human enterprises from failing, of managing the relationships that made everything else possible, of holding the institutional knowledge that allowed a family's affairs to be conducted with intelligence, rather than merely with money. This work happened in rooms that were designed to look like the rooms of leisure, and the women who did it were dressed in the clothes of leisure and surrounded by the objects of leisure, and the world looked at them and saw leisure, and recorded what it saw. The gap between what was seen and what was happening is the subject of this story, and it is not a small gap. It is, in the period these women inhabited, one of the central facts of American life, a fact so embedded in the structure of things that it was almost invisible, which is precisely why it has been so slowly and incompletely recovered. You're almost entirely still now, the kind of still that is the other side of waking, the country of sleep, and you are at its border, or perhaps you have already crossed it, somewhere in the last few pages without noticing. There was a house in a New England city where a woman named Alice lived for 50 years. She was the wife of a man who had built a dry goods business into a regional retail empire that employed several thousand people at its peak. She was known in the city as a gracious woman, a careful hostess, a devoted mother of 4. The community she was part of valued her warmly and without particular interest, in the way that communities value the wives of prominent men, as an accessory to the prominent man, pleasant and appropriate and not particularly considered on her own terms. After her husband's death, when she was 71 and the business had passed to her sons, she began to write. Not a memoir exactly. She never intended publication, and the work was found after her death in a series of composition books in the bottom drawer of the correspondence table, where it had been placed with the same care that she brought to everything. What she wrote was a history of the business as she had observed and managed it from the inside. A private history, detailed and candid in a way that no official history would be, covering 40 years of decisions and crises and strategies, and the relationships that had sustained or damaged the enterprise at various points. The composition books were found by her youngest daughter, who read them over the course of a week in the spare bedroom of Alice's house, and then sat for a while in the quietness of the realization that she had, for 50 years, been entirely wrong about the nature of her parents' marriage and her mother's role in the enterprise that was the foundation of everything the family had. She thought she had known her mother. She had loved her mother with the straightforward and somewhat unevaluating love of a daughter who has been well cared for and has attributed that good care to a quality called warmth, rather than to the underlying competence and intelligence and sustained effort that had produced it. The composition books were a correction. They were a portrait of a mind at work over 50 years, in the service of people who, in the main, had not thought to wonder very much about that mind. The daughter kept the composition books. She considered, at various points, having them published. They were well written, they were historically interesting, they were a genuine document of a world that was changing. But she came eventually to the conclusion that her mother had written them for herself, not for an audience, and that the privacy was part of their meaning. They represented the space that Alice had carved out for herself in the arrangement of her life, the private room of her own judgment, in which the things that could not be said elsewhere could be said, and the record could be kept, and the work could be acknowledged, even if only by the person who had done it. That private room is the final image of this story. Not the drawing room with the fireplace and the mantelpiece clock, not the correspondence table with the card file, and the pale ribbon and the box of letters, not the morning room where the accounts were reviewed, or the sitting room where the visitors were received. The private room, the one that has no location in the house because it exists inside the person who carries it, where the knowledge is held and the record is kept and the work is acknowledged. These women lived in constrained worlds. The constraints were real and had real costs, and it would be wrong to romanticize them. But within those constraints, in the spaces they found and the work they made, and the intelligence they applied without acknowledgement to the enterprises that depended on them, there was something that is worth understanding. There was capability meeting difficulty with a kind of patient creativity. There was intelligence at work in the service of real things that mattered. There was, in the private rooms, a fullness that the formal record leaves out. The rooms are quiet now, and you are quiet too. The correspondence table stands in the spare bedroom of the house in Connecticut, and the drawer holds the letter and the notebook and the box with the pale ribbon. And outside the window, the garden that someone is slowly letting return to its own devices spreads in the October light, unhurried and self-possessed. The work was real. The rooms held it. The night holds it still, the way the night holds all the things that the day forgot to record, steadily, completely, without a word. Thank you so much for watching. If you'd like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. It really helps us keep making more content. See you in the next one. The drawing room is quiet. The fire has burned all the way down now to the last grey ash, and the room has grown a little cooler, the way rooms do in the deep of the night when the warmth that was built up over an evening begins slowly to release into the air. The curtains are still drawn against whatever's outside. The clock on the mantelpiece still keeps its careful time, though there is no one left to hear it but the darkness. The desk in the corner is empty. The papers have been sorted and stacked and covered with a cloth, the way papers are covered when the working day, or the working night, is finally finished. The cigarette in the crystal ashtray is cold. The carafe of water on the side table is untouched. The lamp has been extinguished. Somewhere upstairs the house is breathing, the slow exhalation of a building in the deep hours, the particular settling of walls and floors that have been warm all day and are now releasing that warmth into the quiet air. A door that was left slightly ajar moves once, barely, in a draught so small it does not stir the curtain. A floorboard accepts the weight of the cooling night. The woman is upstairs. The work is done. Tomorrow the correspondence table will be busy again, the card file open, the morning's letters arranged by category and urgency in the system that only she fully understands. Tomorrow the house will fill again with the small and large operations of a life in full motion. Tomorrow the world will resume its usual arrangement, in which what is visible and what is real are not the same thing, and never quite have been. But tonight the room is still. Tonight the house is still. Tonight you are still finally in the deep and steady place that the night has been offering you all along, patient as a tide, certain as the dark. Let the warmth of the story settle around you now. Let the rooms go dark one by one. Let the mantelpiece clock slow until it is only a feeling, a pulse, barely there. The women in this story knew what they knew. They did what they did. The houses they tended are mostly gone, or changed beyond recognition, but the work they did in them was real, and it held things together that might otherwise have come apart. And the city beyond the window, any city, every city, carries the shape of it still, in buildings that were funded and in institutions that were built and in the families that were sustained through the complicated machinery of invisible competence. Sleep now. The desk is cleared, the lamp is out, the fire is cold and the night is a great soft thing, immense and quiet, and you are entirely held within it. If you like this video, let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is. I'm always curious about that. And if you have a suggested topic, feel free to leave it in the comments.